Welcome to this week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. I'm John Strum, and I'm the host of the Real Talk MS podcast. Each week, Real Talk MS reaches thousands of people in more than 100 countries around the world with the news that people affected by MS need to know. My wife, Jean, lived with progressive MS for 23 years, so I've had a front row seat experiencing all the ways that MS can impact a family. Today, I'll be asking our expert the questions you want answered. Please feel free to post your comments and questions on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch. MS Navigators will be online throughout today's live program, answering those questions and connecting you to resources. Grieving is a normal response to any loss, including those losses you might experience or associate with living with MS. In many ways, grief is a negative experience, but grief also allows us to survive change. For people with MS, grieving can play an important role in reevaluating and sometimes reprioritizing life. Joining me today to discuss healthy grieving is Dr. Holly Hendin, a faculty physician and psychiatrist at St. Joseph's Hospital Medical Group Outpatient Behavioral Health in Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome, Dr. Hendin, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate this chance to talk to you about grief and the grief process and how that sometimes shows up in the lives of people who have been diagnosed with MS. So thank you.
Well, let's start with the definition.
Yeah.
How do you define grief, and how does it differ from other feelings like sadness or loss?
Yeah, for me, and I think for many people, grief is separate, although it can certainly involve sadness. It is usually described as a complex set of emotions that arise in the loss of someone or something that is very important to us, usually someone or something that is very key in our lives, in our identities. And the emotions that arise with grief can be so complex, tumultuous. They can include sadness and anxiety and shame and anger, and it's just a host of emotions in response to loss.
I know grief always feels very personal, but
Yeah.
is there a typical way that people experience grief?
Yeah, I would say, grief is such a human emotion. It really is. It's an emotion that arises usually when we lose someone or something, as I said, that was part of our identity, but also someone or something that we loved very dearly. And so, as with love, there is no one course that could really describe everybody's love journey. There is no one course that could really describe everybody's grief journey. It's so personal. Some people have tried to make sense of it by creating kind of an outline, like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with this idea in the 60s and 70s when she was trying to think about the stages that somebody might go through when they're dying. And then she later translated that to the stages maybe people would go through when they were grieving. And I would say it's nice to think about it in her way because it does provide a little bit of a handle to kind of jump into the discussion of grief. In some ways, grief can be like a dream. It's very difficult to describe when you try to put words to dreams. You often think, "Oh, that wasn't quite right. I could say the words, but that's not really what I experienced." And grief can be the same way. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross said there was this process that people go through, different emotions. They start with denial, move into anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. I think it really makes sense when you think about maybe somebody going through the dying process, because acceptance generally does come at the very end of life. In the grieving process, it's so iterative. It really is kind of like you could be angry, then you could be sad, then you could feel like you're accepting everything, then it starts all over again. So I feel like Yeah, grief there are some hallmarks of it in terms of what it is and how people move through it. But at the same time, paradoxically, there is no one way to grieve. And I would say, even though we're not talking about, we're talking about grief and MS, but even grief in the face of the loss of a loved one, sometimes people just feel numb, and that numbness, that's not denial, that's just numbness, it's protection. So yeah, very, very varied.
At the time someone is diagnosed with MS,
Yeah,
they've probably experienced some MS symptoms,
yeah,
but they haven't necessarily experienced any loss yet.
yeah.
So, why might someone experience grief at the time they're diagnosed?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so interesting because I would say that the grief is the grief for the the imagined future self, and what that future, held for the individual, whether it was, professional or love or family. I think we're so good as humans at telling ourselves stories. And in some ways, it is that the shock of the diagnosis and the uncertainty of the diagnosis, and then the uncertainty of the future, and then the stories that we tell ourselves. Oh my gosh, now I'm never going to, um, you know, be able to have children, or I'm never going to be happy again, or I'm never going to find someone who wants to marry me, or the person I'm married to isn't going to want to stay with me. It's the grief that surrounds those stories that we tell ourselves about our imagined future self and our imagined future lives. And I don't think it's unhealthy. I think that it is natural and normal to experience that, but I think it's always helpful to have somebody to kind of ground you in the reality of the situation, which is you are still yourself. You still have a beautiful future ahead of you. There's so much to look forward to, but I think it's hard in the moment. It's just such a shock, really, like a death. And then all of the stories that we tell ourselves.
Zoe tells us she was just diagnosed with MS
Yeah.
and she wants to get a second opinion. Now, is that different from being in denial about that diagnosis?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great question. So, denial is often the unwillingness to believe or engage with something. And so, with the diagnosis of MS, I would say denial would be that she just leaves the, medical community altogether and says, "Nope, I don't have MS. I'm going to go back to the way I was living my life," and then proceed from there. I feel like, everybody is entitled to, and I encourage people to feel empowered to take control of their medical journey as much as possible. So with my patients, I really, really want them to trust me enough to be vulnerable with me, to trust me enough to listen to the things that I have to say. But if that trust isn't there, or if they are worried that that maybe there are other people out there that have different opinions, or diagnoses, or offer different treatments than me, I always say it never hurts my feelings, and hopefully all doctors feel this way. It is not something I take personally, because I'm here to serve my patients. And so as a patient, I want people to be able to really feel like they're getting all of the information, and I want them to feel like they trust their doctor. So in this scenario, I would say a second opinion could be many things, but in my mind, a second opinion really highlights this idea of like, I don't really trust what this person is saying to me for whatever reason, because I don't want to believe it, or maybe because I was rushed through this appointment and I didn't get to have all my questions answered, or because it just didn't feel right to me. And so I feel like seeking out a second opinion can sometimes be a really wonderful way to find a provider that you really resonate with, that you really trust enough to be vulnerable with, because it's so important in the medical journey. Yeah.
After Camilla was diagnosed with MS, she says her faith was tested. Her prayers were all about trying to make a deal with a higher power to
Yeah.
rid herself of MS. Now, what are some strategies Camilla could use to reconcile her faith with her new reality and navigate this bargaining phase of grieving while continuing to value her beliefs?
Yeah, for sure. I would say that, unfortunately, bargaining usually does not turn out very well, especially in the face of something like death, dying, or a disease. Um, it's just, there is no way to bargain your way through it. Um, MS is at this point not a disease that can be cured, but it can certainly be mitigated for many, many people by seeking out care and then also by engaging with things like prayer, meditation, community, hope. I would say that engaging with your higher power, if that's something that really has been meaningful for you throughout your life, and has brought you community and a sense of calm and peace, actually is really, really good for your body, because anything that is calming for your body also helps really relieve a lot of the stress and tension that comes from our everyday lives of being human. So I think it's wonderful to have prayers, to have hope, community, faith. All of that is a really wonderful thing. It's just unfortunately not something that will help cure a disease. But if you are able to, really say to yourself, there is a piece of higher power, whatever your idea of higher power or healer within me. And I can't cure the things that are happening in my body, but I can try as much as possible to heal them. Then I think that's the beginning of a good journey. Not, will you get rid of this for me, but how can I help myself heal as much as I can? Yeah.
Richard has lived with progressive MS for almost 2 decades, and he tells us he still bounces between anger and depression about his diagnosis. How long does it usually take someone to reach that final stage of grief and feel that sense of acceptance?
Well, unfortunately, I feel like, grief is, as I mentioned earlier, a really unique um, journey for everybody. And some people never get to that true place of acceptance. It just, unfortunately, doesn't arrive. And I think that anger and depression are valid emotions. They usually tell us that something in our life is not going the way that we want it to. In this case, if it's anger and depression about MS, then I would say there are ways to help move through and into. Even though it sounds strange, I would encourage people to kind of really lean into the negative emotions, not try to push them away, not try to rush into a sense of acceptance. Um, you don't have to say, oh, well, I'm just going to be angry and depressed forever. It's not that. It's that you really allow yourself to feel the negative emotions, the sadness, the grief, like we're talking about, just like this really feels very sad to me. And that's okay. Giving yourself that compassion and that ability to feel. If it's too difficult, which it can be for many, many people, there are professionals out there who really want to help. People like me, psychiatrists, there are therapists, sometimes family members. But I would say that trying to rush to some sort of finish line of acceptance is not possible, and also usually backfires. When we suppress negative emotions, they almost always come back, and they tend to come back a little stronger. So if we can find a way to accept the grief, accept the depression, accept the anger, and try to find a way to move into it, that's the way that we actually move through it. It sounds paradoxical. It's not easy. I'm not saying that this is an easy journey, but it is the way through. Yeah.
I want to circle back to that idea of leaning into the negative emotions in
Yeah.
just a moment. But I want to ask you about a listener, Carlos, who said after he was diagnosed, he found himself imagining like an idealized version of what his life would have been
Yeah.
versus how it is.
Yeah.
He feels that MS has robbed him of his potential. So,
Yeah.
what are some ways that Carlos can move through his grief and focus on his future?
Yeah. I would say that, you asked me earlier, how is grief different from sadness or depression or loss? And I would say one of the really beautiful things that grief can offer us, even though it is very, very difficult, is that grief can really be transformational if we allow it to be. It doesn't always go that way. For some people, it's very difficult, too difficult, and for many people, too difficult to do alone. So that's, when you really want to reach out to friends, family, community, support groups, your doctors, your therapist, for the help and support, to really start to uh, think of that idealized version of yourself, to really allow yourself to grieve. I mean, it's a real thing. Stories that we tell ourselves become real because we have told ourselves those stories. So I would say, really, uh, I would encourage people to really start to walk it back and say, MS has not changed who I am at my core. I am not all the things that I did. I am myself, and I have so much to offer as a human being. Um, Kindness, love, compassion, empathy, creativity. Maybe you write poetry. Maybe you are an appreciator of art. Maybe you know everything there is to know about Volkswagens. And these are things that are still part of you that you can still share. So even though it feels like your identity has been robbed or your future has been robbed, I would say that the real way through that is to really find the meaning and purpose of your life. And it doesn't have to be this big thing of like, the meaning and purpose was that I was going to be a doctor, and now I can't do that because I can't go to school. And it could be, the meaning and purpose of my life is that I really want to engage with MS. I really want to find the best way through that. I really want to be the person that can sit with my negative emotions. I want to learn how to practice mindfulness. I want to watch every movie that there is on a certain topic. Meaning and purpose is so unique and individual, that it can come from so many different places. You can still be an activist, a volunteer, a doctor, a lawyer. You are still yourself. You are yourself with MS. And that is a beautiful thing. It can be transformational. And I don't want to candy coat MS or grief and say it's this easy thing and, oh, yay, what a gift. But it can. Going through a hard journey is always, always transformational. So look back at all the hard things that you have gone through already and think about all the ways that you have already transformed. I like to think, I know maybe it's cliche, but it's kind of like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. Like, there is a really messy, kind of gross phase of a chrysalis. And I mean, everything about that caterpillar has to dissolve. And it's just, it's not pretty, but there is a transformation into a butterfly. And so, as much as possible, think about your own life in that transformational way and finding meaning, purpose, connection, love, and remembering that at your core, you have meaning and that you are still the same you from before the diagnosis.
Harriet tells us that experiencing a relapse has forced her to slow down.
Yeah.
And she's come to realize that she's been suppressing her negative feelings about having MS.
Yeah.
And this is a question you've actually already started to answer. So,
Yeah.
why is it important for Harriet to honestly acknowledge where she's at?
Yeah, I mean, MS and the nature of MS, especially if you have the relapsing remitting form, is really you will experience that grief over and over again. And negative emotions that you thought maybe you had already moved into the acceptance phase will come back again and again if you are not honestly saying to yourself, I am going to experience the sadness. I am going to think about the loss, any negative emotions that are coming up. I'm going to be present for them, and I am going to allow them to be with me so that I can move in and through this journey, either the one that's right now or the bigger journey of life. And I would say, it's okay to recognize that we need help, and it is okay to ask for help. And sometimes we feel like I'm just going to do this by myself and nobody understands and nobody could really help me. But a lot of times, the way in and through the negative emotions is with the help of others, with community, with honest conversations, with one of the ways that we suppress emotions is really by avoiding them. And that avoidance really shelters us, it protects us, and we feel good in the moment that we're not experiencing sadness, loss, anger, depression. But it also blocks true connection with ourselves and with others. And I really believe that connecting with self and others is the way to move into this transformation that of who am I? What is my purpose? How can I live my life to the fullest? What do I still want? Life is precious. It really is. If you've ever lost a loved one, it's really shocking sometimes that life is so precious and so finite, and none of us know when the end is coming. So knowing that, what do I want today to look like? What do I want? What do I want my life to be like? And how do I make that happen? And if you need support from your doctors, from your community, from your loved ones, to find the strength to encourage to ask for it.
Jonathan says confronting his feelings, it's just too painful. You'd
Yeah.
rather not think about them, you'd
Yeah.
rather just ignore them.
Yeah.
But how can that strategy work against Jonathan in the long run?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of experts in trauma really believe that when we suppress emotions, they don't go away. They land somewhere in our body, and they continue to kind of remind us on a daily basis of the things that we are trying to suppress. Yes, negative emotions are difficult and they're painful. And if they are too much to bear, I would say that there are medications out there that can kind of soften some of the negative emotions. They won't take them away, but they soften them to a point where you actually start to think, you know what? I think I got this. Like, I think I can sit with this. I can sit with this for now. I can ask for help. And then you start to say, maybe I don't need these medications. Maybe I don't need this dose. Maybe I can sit with just a little bit more, just a little bit more. And then you can move through them. If you're not a medication person, then there are things like meditation, which is designed to do something similar, which is to give you a sense of, in this moment, I have this. Like, I got this. I can sit with the negative emotions for this amount of time. Next time, this amount of time, this amount of time. And then you move through them. But I would say that you do need to ask for help. That's the hardest part. It really is taking that first step of, I think I need help. This is too much for me. And I've always been such an independent person. Why can't I just muscle my way through this? And that's just not the way that emotions work. They can't be muscled through, unfortunately.
Grief can also be accompanied by feelings of loneliness.
Yeah.
And Leona says she's lived with MS for 5 years and
Yeah.
she sometimes struggles with the quiet of everyday life.
Yeah.
Now, is loneliness something that can be diagnosed or treated with medication?
Yeah, unfortunately, I would say loneliness, kind of like MS, can be a very invisible disease. People could be surrounded by friends, coworkers, loved ones, and still feel lonely. It's not a disease that could be diagnosed or treated with medication, but it can be treated with connection. And again, as I mentioned earlier, suppression of emotions can often lead to this sense of protecting ourselves, but then it creates a barrier between ourselves and our loved ones. And that's why you could be right next to somebody that you love and who loves you, and still feel lonely. And it's only with this kind of opening up of honest conversations. I'm scared you don't love me. I'm scared you are going to leave me. I feel like I'm a burden. Can you be on this journey with me? Can I ask you for help? With a close loved one, can really break down that wall that has been created, that is making you feel lonely and isolated. And then, if you are truly isolated in that you do have a quiet day-to-day life and you don't have friends, family, coworkers, then it is a little bit of a wake-up call, or a bird song to let you know that now is the time to start reaching out. There are support groups. There are, other types of groups out there, people who love to read, people who love board games, people who like to cook. Join the groups that you think could create connections for you. And I would say, don't be afraid to bring up loneliness and grief to your doctors and ask, what is available? What resources are available for me? And then start to take those steps. And that's really the medication for loneliness, is connection.
I've heard you mention the value of asking for help a
Yeah.
couple of times.
Yeah.
And we heard from Adam, who says he doesn't want to admit to his friends or family that he is
Yeah.
lonely. He's afraid it will make him look weak.
Yeah.
So, how can Adam have those conversations without feeling shame?
Yeah, I would say, loneliness is very pervasive. As I mentioned before, even the people who don't, to our eyes, appear to be lonely because they appear to be surrounded by people that love them and that they love. Um, Loneliness is a feeling, and you can never truly know the feelings of another person. So the first step is recognizing that you would be shocked at how many people feel lonely, and that in opening up to others, you will almost certainly start to hear other people feel lonely. The mind exercise that I sometimes have my patients do is to imagine that your friend or loved one is coming to you and saying to you, I feel lonely, but I've felt so ashamed to bring this up because I didn't want to appear weak. How would you respond to them? Would you tell them, "Oh, you're so weak. That's terrible. What a terrible person." No, you would never say that to them. We are often the worst critics to ourselves. We are our own worst enemy for the most part. So, and shame is something that only grows when it's kept quiet. So the first thing about shame is we turn a light on it, we see what it is, we name it, loneliness, shame, and then we start to seek out honest conversations where we ask others for help. It's not weak. It's actually the bravest, strongest thing that you could do. The often, it takes the unimaginable strength to take that first step and say, I need help. That is strength. That really is strength. Yeah.
Well, you've shared some valuable insights about a subject that isn't discussed nearly enough.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, what would you say is the top takeaway that you'd like our viewers to remember and use for themselves?
Yeah, I would say the top takeaway is that you are not alone. MS can create a host of emotions, grief, loneliness, and you are not alone in what you are feeling. So if you could seek out community, if you could seek out connection, if you can take that first step and ask for help, you will really, the future you is already thanking you for that step. They really are. They are saying, thank you for being strong and asking for help, building community, building connection, starting to talk about the hard stuff. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone for submitting some outstanding comments and questions. And thank you, Dr. Hendin, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we close, I want to remind you that the National MS Society's MS Navigator team is your best partner when it comes to connecting you to the very best information and resources on living with MS. You can reach an MS Navigator by phone, email, or through the Society's website by chat. For information and resources on MS, please be sure to visit the Society's website. You'll find research updates and news, information on connection programs like self-help groups and MS Friends. You'll hear about ways to get involved, and you'll find out about upcoming events that are taking place near you. Remember, you can connect with the National MS Society and others affected by MS on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And I hope you'll join me every week on the Real Talk MS podcast, where we continue the conversation that I start here. You'll find Real Talk MS at realtalkms.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I'd like to thank Dr. Hendin for joining us today. Please remember that a recording of this webcast will be available at the Society's website at nationalmssociety.org/MSexpert, as well as on Facebook and YouTube. I hope you'll join us at this same time for next week's edition of Ask an MS Expert. You can always find our upcoming program topics on the National MS Society's website. And now I have a favor to ask each of you. Getting your feedback on today's webcast is important. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll see a link to a survey pinned to the comments section. On YouTube, you'll find that link in the program description, and on Twitch, you can find that link in the chat. Completing the survey makes a real difference. The information you provide helps us continuously improve, and it helps shape future programs. The survey takes just 1 minute, so I hope you'll take a minute to fill it out. On behalf of Dr. Holly Hendin and the National MS Society, I want to thank you once again for joining us. Please stay safe and make healthy choices.